Alright guys, so Joe Biden recently had a White House event where he was trying to bring together a bunch of online social media influencer young people types to basically try to bolster his standing with young people ahead of the 2024 November election, where he's significantly struggling with what should be a core part of his constituency. And as this event was going on, one of the people who he invited to this event, one of the influencers, asks him about Israel and Gaza, and Joe Biden just basically loses it on this guy and kind of sort of like threatens to throw his phone or something. So let's go ahead and watch this, and then I got some more polling data for you guys showing some of the issues with Joe Biden's current campaign. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
And I know you're a typical press guy. You're grabbing me in front of this, all this. And I trust you as far as I throw your phone. I have a good arm, man.
I'm sure you can.
I can throw it a long way. But my point is this.
Yes.
I have made very clear to the Israelis what they have to do in the near term. If they don't, what's going to happen?
What's going to happen? Is the U.S. going to cut off funding?
I came because usually you tell me I have a nice suit and you didn't comment on my suit today, so I don't feel a little offended.
No.
Thank you. Can you sit back in, sir, please? Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot that's going on there, right? So before this clip starts here, right, because clearly Joe is responding to something that the social media person, it's Jonathan Katz, was asking him. He asked him a general question about Israel and Gaza, and Joe's initial response is to first off butcher the phrase, which is supposed to go something like, I trust you as far as I can throw you, which is to say, like, I can't throw you very far, therefore I don't really trust you that much. He kind of butchered it, and he said, like, I trust you as far as I could throw your phone, and also I have a really good arm, so I could throw your phone really far, which I guess would mean you trust him a lot. So anyways, he butchers that phrase. Then the guy basically follows up and he says, what are you going to do about Israel and Gaza, right? Is there any red line? Would you potentially think about cutting off weapons to Israel? Which, by the way, we're far past that point. We should be talking about sanctions. But anyways, he asks them that, and then Joe says, I've been very clear with the Israelis. And then he pauses for about what felt like an hour to describe exactly how he's been clear. And then he says, there's going to be something that happens, right? We don't know what's going to happen if Israel doesn't listen to Joe. There certainly hasn't been any consequences yet. But he says a lot is going to happen, right, if Israel doesn't listen to him. Now, the pushback on that is that obviously, first off, you have not been clear about exactly what your red lines are. You initially said that going into Rafah was one of your red lines. What happened to that? Israel went into Rafah. Then you said, okay, it's actually that we don't think there should be a major military campaign inside of Rafah. Okay, well, there's been a major military campaign inside of Rafah. I mean, they rolled in the tanks, they brought in the troops, they bombed it into oblivion. We've seen numerous different war crimes that have been committed in broad daylight inside of Rafah. They've displaced hundreds of thousands of people. If that's not a major military campaign, then that phrase has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. So we've all seen you draw sort of like fake red lines and then do absolutely jack shit to enforce them. So like, you haven't been clear about exactly what your red lines are, and you certainly haven't been clear with the Israelis in terms of an actual point of meaningfully cutting off weapons. You've done some tweaks around the edges. Okay, I won't send you this batch of 500-pound bombs to go and drop on a refugee camp, but you're continuing to give them billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, right? You're continuing to give them diplomatic cover. You're continuing to do everything that they want you to do, right? As they continue, by the way, to sabotage your, supposed peace process, right? They're sabotaging the current deal that Joe Biden insisted was Israel's deal. And you got Benjamin Netanyahu running out there every day saying, no, I actually completely disagree with this deal, right? So at every step throughout this, you've been humiliated. Israel has been completely ignoring everything that you've been telling them to do from the beginning of this. So it's an entirely reasonable question from this person here, right? And of course, Joe doesn't really have an answer. And so then you have basically his staff members, or I guess security, who was working detail at this event, and they basically just like push the guy off. They're like, okay, come with us. You got to leave. You got to leave. This is somebody you invited, right? Which leads into the political point here, which is that obviously Joe Biden's wrong on the substance. He's wrong morally. He's wrong, in all of these different ways when it comes to his Israel policy. But how are you also completely butchering the politics of this? Like this should not be a difficult thing for Joe Biden to handle. in this kind of a situation. You could give some sort of a, somewhat meaningful bullshit answer and just talk about how you're tirelessly working to end the war and yada, yada, yada. And of course, I'll cut off the weapons, blah, 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 blah. You could try to have a workable answer here, but you just completely fold and like vaguely threaten to throw this guy's phone because he dared to ask you a question at an event that you fucking invited him to. So if this is your strategy to winning back young people who you're currently bleeding support from, then how is this going to work? I mean, we've seen reporting. I just read this interesting article here from the New York Times. It's called Don't Forget to Like, Subscribe, and Vote. Biden's rocky influencer courtship. The Biden campaign is trying to work its way into social media feeds, but the young, left-leaning voices that control that conversation aren't making it easy. And it's like, well, yeah, first off, it shouldn't be easy, right? He's a politician. You shouldn't just allow him to spout off propaganda on your behalf if you are some sort of a social media influencer. That's number one. But it's also like, yeah, it's not going to be easy if you're not actually listening to the material concerns of young people. This is the issue, right? And I encourage you guys to go read this entire article because it really gives you an insight into how delusional the Biden campaign seems to be when it comes to why he's bleeding support from young people. Like, they seem to genuinely believe, oh, all we need to do is just get a couple celebrities, right? And to get a couple young people who are super pro-Democrat to go and post memes on Instagram and TikTok, and that's going to win over young people. Like, there is no change in policy that is a part of their calculation here. They don't seem to understand that, like, hey, the top concerns of young people right now are, number one, you're supporting a genocide in Gaza, and other material issues like the price of housing, the fact that young people in my generation, a vast majority of whom will never have any prospects of ever owning a home, let alone even be able to, like, avoid paying rent at the end of the month in a stable way. We care about wages. We care about having something like universal health care, addressing climate change in a meaningful capacity. Like, these are all very specific, tangible policies that young people care about. There's a reason that Bernie Sanders was so popular with young people in 2016 and 2020. It's because he was running on a very clear, laid out policy agenda that was giving young people something to be hopeful for in the future, right? Not just sort of like a neoliberal, let's just manage the status quo and vote for me because I'm not as bad as Donald Trump kind of thing. That's not what young people are looking for. But that's what Joe Biden's campaign seems to think is needed. Oh, we just need to go on TikTok and have some people post like Joe Biden in, a Camaro or whatever, wearing his aviators like he's doing here, and, eating ice cream, right? Young people love ice cream. That's what we need. We need more Joe Biden ice cream content on TikTok. I mean, this is the kind of ideas that I think are floating around in Biden's campaign, which is also, part of another major issue with Joe Biden is that, listen, guys, he's just too fucking old. He's just too old. And I don't mean in terms of the number, like his age number, but in terms of his senility, in terms of the fact that anybody who has been paying attention to Joe Biden for the last decade or so, or at least since he was in the Obama administration, we've seen him decline. Okay, this is not a secret. This is not up in the air. There's been a massive decline in his cognitive abilities. We see this all the time with him doing old man shit on repeat. It's nothing personal against him. It's obviously nothing against old people in general. But like, I've had two grandparents that have gone through dementia, right? It's something I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. Okay, so to have somebody as the most powerful human being on the face of the planet who most likely has at least the early stages of dementia, like, this should not be acceptable. It's not a personal attack. It's not anything like that. It's just like, what the fuck are we doing with this guy running for re-election? I mean, even Joe Biden back in 2020 was floating the idea that, like, okay, maybe I'll just be sort of the bridge to the next generation, right? That was sort of the idea in 2020 was, you're not going to stick around here, right? You're not going to run for re-election in 2024. But he's insisting on doing that. Now, some more polling data here to give us an idea of how much Joe Biden is currently struggling with young people and other core parts of his constituents, because again, it's not just young people, it's also African Americans, it's also Hispanic Americans, I mean, core parts of his constituency. So here from NPR, you can look at it, if the 2024 presidential election were being held today, which candidate would you support? And here's the breakdown by age. So they have overall in this poll, and I guess this is a national poll, so this isn't going like swing state by swing state, so it's not as accurate in terms of the electoral outcome, but nationally they say Joe Biden at 33%, Donald Trump at 31%, someone else at 21%, absolutely massive. And then RFK Jr. 11%, and then Cornel West down there at 2%. So I guess a huge part of like this national poll outcome in November is going to be, where do these someone else people end up? Do they stay home? Do they vote Trump? Do they vote RFK? Do they vote Cornel West? Do they vote for Joe Biden? That's going to basically decide this election, it looks like. You know, we also have here from age groups, again, 18 to 26. So that's my demographic here. 32% for Joe Biden and 33% for Donald Trump. So in my age demographic, which as a whole skews heavily left-wing, overwhelmingly, if you gave 18 to 26-year-olds in this country a choice between Trump, Biden, and Bernie, they'd pick Bernie. But amongst that demographic, a Democratic president, Joe Biden, is losing to Donald Trump. That's insane. There's nothing else to say. That is totally insane, guys. Now, age 27 to 40, so slightly older than I am. I mean, he's winning, but again, it's very close margins. This is not usual demographic breakdowns by age for a Democrat versus a Republican in a national election. Now, we also, over at Breaking Points, with our partners at JL Partners, had these word clouds done, right? And so basically they go and they ask people, you know, summarize Joe Biden in one word, summarize Donald Trump in one word. And then they break it down by the demographics, right? Here's what Democrats think of Joe Biden. Here's what Democrats think of Trump. Here's what Republicans think of Trump. Here's what Republicans think of Biden. And one of the things that stood out here, okay, well, two things that I'll mention that stood out here. The first one is that, as you can see here in these word clouds, right, the bigger, the bolder the word is, the more often it was mentioned. The number one word amongst all voters in this one was old. Now, this didn't just apply. This is the crazy thing. In these word clouds, it wasn't just all voters who were describing Joe Biden mostly as old. It was also Republicans. It was also independents. And it was also Democrats. Guys, with the Democratic voter base, the number one word used to describe Joe Biden was old. That's a problem. That's a massive problem for this campaign. When your own party is saying, yeah, you're probably too old to be doing this. Can we get someone else maybe? Right? And that's been the case for months and months and months. Democrats have just been completely ignoring it. Now, in terms of these word clouds, it's not as if Trump's words were fantastic, right? I think the main word for Donald Trump as a part of these was criminal or like corrupt or authoritarian, right? Words like that. But, you know, with Republicans, they overwhelmingly viewed Trump as like patriotic and American and whatever else the case may be, a businessman. But like, this is the overwhelming view of Joe Biden. He's old, he's incompetent, he's senile. Then there's some positive words there like, you know, trustworthy. This one was just country for some reason. Somebody just said country. And, you know, liar. Biden is another one. Joe comes up there. This is not a good situation, right, for a Democratic incumbent. Now, the second thing I was going to mention about this is that there was a different word cloud that was essentially associated with like, if you had your dream pick for who could be the president right now, who would it be, right? You could pick anybody. It could be a celebrity, an athlete, a politician. It could be literally anybody. And you had Biden in there. The main one that they had there that was larger than everything else was Obama. So Obama, you know, is viewed much more positively than Joe Biden, right? Which is interesting. But the most notable thing from that is that basically nowhere, not even in the small print of that word cloud, was Kamala Harris, the vice president. The person who there's a very, you know, significant non-zero chance that if Biden wins, she could end up being the president, right? Because Joe Biden could just die in office. That's not a, you know, 0% chance of that happening. It's a high percent chance of that happening, actually, if you ask me. But so the person who has the potential to be the next president, if Joe Biden wins re-election, and the person who presumptively you would think would take up the mantle after Joe Biden, right? Not something I want to see, but she's the vice president, right? And she was nowhere to be found on that word cloud. Think about how disastrous of a vice presidential pick that is, where 4 years into this, and people aren't even considering her. They're not even considering her. They don't even think of her name when they're thinking about their dream president. You had guys like Jon Stewart. You had like random celebrities that were thrown in there. You know, I think one of them was Keanu Reeves. I mean, you have people saying, I would want Keanu Reeves to be the president before Kamala Harris. Now, to be fair, I'd probably vote for Keanu Reeves, right? He seems like a good guy. But the fact that the vice president is not on there is, you know, absolutely astounding. Now, a couple more polls and I'll end this video off. There was a new Iowa Des Moines Register poll that was done just to show the approval rating amongst young people in Iowa. Now, granted, this is Iowa. It's not a state that Joe Biden won back in 2020. It's not one that he's going to win in 2024. But this was a state that Obama won, I believe, both times in 2012 and 2008. So it's not as if this is a state that's like totally right-wing and, irredeemable for Democrats. But amongst young people in Iowa, Joe Biden has a 15% approval rating. 15. And a 76% disapproval rating. That's like, what is that? What are we talking about? Like a 60-point gap there, almost a 50-point gap or so? I'm not going to do the math in my head. Something like that. In terms of a negative approval rating amongst young people in the state of Iowa. Now, we also had another interesting thing that was pointed out here by Dave Weigel. No Democrat has gotten under 40% in Iowa since 1980. Biden is at 32%, and that would be the worst performance of a Democrat since 1924. And we've also seen the polling showing that Joe Biden is significantly trailing in the polls relative to how the Senate Democratic candidates are doing. So, in other words, he's a massive drag on the Democrats' chances to keep the Senate and to take the House in the November elections. There are some of these Senate elections where the Democratic candidate is like 10-15% ahead of Joe Biden in the national polls, or in that state's polls as well. Like, what are we doing here, guys? What are we doing here pretending that Joe Biden is a strong candidate? This is something I care about because, and this is something Democrats should care about, right? Because you guys are constantly talking about, and I agree with a lot of this, the threat of Donald Trump and Republicans being in full control of the government. What kind of damage they could do to our institutions, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whatever the case may be, the National Labor Relations Board, the FTC, the kind of damage that a Trump administration could do is significant, right? It's not to be understated. So if those are the stakes, and as Democrats put it, this is like the greatest existential threat to democracy in the history of the country. If those are the stakes, why are you going with this guy? Why are you going with arguably one of the least popular candidates in the history of the Democratic Party? Like, there's actually nobody who you could sub in there. Nobody's willing to confront Joe Biden to try to put pressure on him to step down. Nobody was willing, no high-profile Democrats were willing to step in and to run against him in the primary contest. I mean, it is so pathetic, especially given the gravity that they're trying to portray in this moment. But they basically seem to think that, like, they can use the strategy of just saying, look at how awful and bad Trump is, right? And that's going to be enough to overcome all of Joe Biden's shortfalls, right? People will look past, right, the lack of, addressing the material needs of average working class people and young people. They'll look past the genocide in Gaza because they'll realize, oh, Trump is bad. Guys, I'm sorry, but at this point, and granted, I could be wrong on this, but I feel like people kind of know one way or the other whether or not they support Trump, right? This guy's been a complete con man throughout basically his entire life. He's now a convicted felon. This is a guy who helped to usher in January 6th and, this massive, like, chaotic semi-coup attempt and tried to overturn the results of the last election. I mean, this is a guy whose biggest accomplishment was a massive tax cut to wealthy billionaires and corporations. And against this guy, you're performing this poorly, right? Against this guy, who we all saw be the president for 4 years, right? And you still can't do better than this. There should be red flags going off everywhere in the Democratic Party. But it's like just head in the sand shit. We'll just remind people that Trump is bad. And we'll just say, listen, we're not as bad as Trump. And so that's going to be enough to win the election. I mean, I'm still at this point, guys, I don't even know what Joe Biden is running on. I really don't. Like, what is he actually running on that has nothing to do with Trump? Try to give me a list of 5 policies that he said, if Democrats win the Senate, if we win the House, and you guys reelect me, here are the 5 things I'm going to do, right? I'm going to do the public option. Remember when he said he was going to do the public option, right? Maybe I'm going to address housing prices. Maybe I'm going to do... I don't hear him talking at all about what he's going to do. Everything just has to be a contrast with Donald Trump, which, like, to some extent, maybe that works a little bit. But I feel like maybe promising an agenda to uplift people who are struggling right now, maybe that could actually be beneficial in some way. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. We also had this polling. Biden's senior momentum, why he's courting older voters. Guys, at this point, it's like a coin toss as to whether or not Joe Biden is going to do better with seniors than he will with young people. This is a Democratic president that we're talking about here, guys. A Democratic president. And we're talking about him potentially beating Trump with older people, with seniors, but potentially losing to Trump with young people, what world are we living in here? What world are we living here? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with courting older voters, obviously not. And you know, there are some larger dichotomies between Trump and Biden when it comes to old people, like the fact that I think Trump would be very open to cutting Social Security and Medicare and other programs that help older people in this country. But the fact that that's the dynamic that's at play right now, again, also completely insane. Now, one final thing here, just to show you a picture of how much the American people absolutely despise both Trump and Biden. Here from Axios, the dread election share of double haters hits historic high. Share of Americans who say they have unfavorable views of both major presidential candidates. And you can see the comparisons here going all the way back to 1988, where it was Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush. And in that election, I mean, it was down here at like 5% who hated both of them. But I mean, now we're all the way up in 2024 to 25% of the American people hate both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the two major candidates who actually have a chance of winning in this election. 25%. Stunning. Absolutely. I mean, the only thing that's comparable here is back in 2016 with Trump and Hillary Clinton. The idea that Joe Biden has somehow managed to make this election a situation where more people hate both candidates than when it was Trump versus Hillary Rodham Clinton is in and of itself a massive accomplishment, a massive feat. I mean, that is a genuinely hard thing to do. Do you guys remember 2016? How much people absolutely despise Donald Trump and how much people absolutely despise Hillary Clinton? We're outdoing that. Somehow things have gotten worse as time has gone on. Absolutely insane. So there you go, guys. I mean, it's not a pretty picture for Joe Biden. You know, obviously, I've said this before. I don't want Trump to be president, right? I don't want Joe Biden to be president. I really hope that we end up with some sort of a dream scenario where something happens and then we don't have to have either of them come November. But that's unfortunately the situation that we're looking at, right? Now, it's hard to blame anybody who looks at what Joe Biden is doing right now, especially when it comes to his Israel and Gaza policy, and says, you know what, maybe I can't vote for this guy. It's hard to fault anybody who says that, right? Especially if you live in a swing state, you have slightly more of a difficult calculation to make there. You know, it's hard to fault anybody who thinks like that, especially when you have a president who just seemingly has like no interest in actually trying to make overtures outside of the most hollow, vapid bullshit that you could possibly imagine. Oh, I'm going to have like a fancy dinner party for some TikTok celebrities and that'll do it, right? That'll win back young people. No, if you actually want to win the election, right? And I don't want to make a definitive prediction. I'm not saying Joe Biden's 100% going to lose. He could win on this strategy. Trump is that bad that he could potentially skirt by, you know, in a very close election situation and win this election on the current strategy that he's using. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying, why the fuck are we risking it on this horribly weak candidate with a horrible campaign strategy? It's like they're not even fucking trying.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying